My dream is that we have a fight against the regime that expresses all those issues, that expresses the fight against the pension reform, against the antisocial attacks of Macron's government, but also carries the fight against the genocide in Palestine and the complicity of the French government in that, but also carries the fight for LGBT and trans rights and refuses the division that the right is trying to impose.
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. In the last decade, there's been a rightward shift on LGBTQ rights, both in the US and in Europe. This has been especially true for trans rights, where we've seen things like bans on gender-affirming care for minors, we've seen bans on trans people from single-sex spaces and women's sports. What's also notable is that this isn't just coming from the right or the far right. It's not just coming from Republicans in the US, conservatives, the Reform Party in the UK, the AfD party in Germany, or Marine Le Pen in France. Although these are, of course, super transphobic, queerphobic sectors proposing really oppressive policies. The attacks are also coming from the more liberal parties and from the institutional center and institutional left. Just to give one recent example, in the UK, there was a ruling just this year that trans women aren't women and therefore cannot be in women's only spaces. And this ruling came under the Labour government of Keir Starmer. All this to say, we're going through a reversal in state and institutional support for LGBTQ people and rights. And as Pride Month showed us, corporations are also turning their backs on queer people. I want to be super clear here, though. I'm obviously not suggesting that Pepsi, MasterCard, and Walmart were stalwart supporters of queer liberation until 2025. Coca-Cola did not throw the first brick at the Stonewall Inn. But like some mainstream publications have pointed out, Pride Month is looking awfully beige this year. Literally check out the Target Pride collection. It is very funny. And I think it's indicative of the moment and kind of this broader context that we're in. To understand why this is happening, the parallels that we see around the world, especially in Europe, and what it means for a strategy for queer liberation and winning other democratic rights, I spoke to my comrade Sasha Yaropolskaya in France. Sasha is a Russian revolutionary trans activist who is organized with our sister organization, Révolution Permanente, in France, and its feminist and LGBT group, Du Pain et des Roses, or Bread and Roses. Sasha is an immigrant in France, and as she describes at the start of our conversation, she has come to the conclusion that fighting for trans liberation means fighting for political and social revolution. Sasha and I discuss why these attacks on LGBTQ people are ramping up. Specifically, what it means to be at the end of the era of progressive neoliberalism. Progressive neoliberalism, as I've actually discussed in a previous episode that I'll link to in the show notes, is the combination of deregulation, austerity, precarity, and anti-worker politics that favor the wealthy and corporations on the one hand, so neoliberalism, and on the other hand, some pro-diversity rhetoric and politics. In other words, for several decades, progressive movements like gay rights, like lean-in feminism, gave a sort of progressive facade or sheen to neoliberalism. But as Sasha explains, getting co-opted by the state like this was a trap for queer people. Neoliberalism is in crisis, as we've said repeatedly on both this podcast and on our website, and we're seeing inflation, mass inequality, forever wars, and ecological devastation, and even more precarious working and living conditions. So, to put it a little bit simply, and we'll get into this more in depth on the podcast episode, when sectors of people across the world started rejecting neoliberalism, they also ended up rejecting and attacking the empty progressivism that came with it. And pursuing the strategy of lesser evilism during this time, whether in the US or in Europe, has just led to more betrayal. So, what's the solution? The LGBT community is not powerless in the face of these attacks, and it doesn't need to fight alone. In fact, this struggle cannot be separated from other struggles. The directions that my conversation with Sasha took, actually, are, I think, a good representation of this idea. Just to kind of let folks in behind the curtain of this podcast, I reached out to Sasha because I really wanted to talk about queer rights specifically during Pride season. But as you'll hear, we could not have this discussion without also talking about the reproductive rights movement, the immigrant rights movement, labor struggles in France, like the Gilets Jaunes movement and the pension strikes, the Starbucks unionization efforts here in the US, and of course, we also talked about the movement for Palestine. So our struggles, in the sense, are interconnected. So, to quote my interview with Sasha, the antidote to attacks on LGBTQ rights is class politics, revolutionary politics, and building an active political alliance with the working class to overcome the divisive tactics of the far right. Tactics that, as you'll hear Sasha describe, and I was kind of surprised actually to hear the extent of this, unite these reactionary sectors all over the world. Like the kinds of things that we see happening here in the US are the kinds of things that we see happening elsewhere. The far right in, for example, the US is also inspiring the far right in France. What does this all mean, though? This means mobilizing across unions, across the student movements and the social movements. It means building up a working class party with a socialist perspective, able to fight exploitation and all oppression. And of course, this fight for our rights needs to be internationalist. Capitalism is a global system, and its systems of oppression also operate on a global scale. Left Voice is a volunteer-led organization, and we would love your support. You can find us at patreon.com/leftvoice. Follow us on social media. We use the handle left_voice. Here is my interview with Sasha. Sasha, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Oden, for having me.
Yeah, super excited to talk to you today. And before we start, I'd really love to hear a little bit about your background. So you are a member, for example, of a sister organization of Left Voice, Révolution Permanente. You're also in a group called Bread and Roses in English. Can you talk a little bit about yourself and these groups?
So my name is Sasha Yaropolskaya, and basically I'm a Russian political immigrant in France. I came to France 7 years ago now, and I, in the beginning, was doing a lot of LGBT and trans activism, especially in the trans immigrant community in Paris. And that was like a huge way for me to become politicized through discovering the intense trans oppression, but also the intense oppression facing the immigrant communities in France. Like several months after I came, there was a mobilization in France against what we call trans feminicide, which is a murder that targets trans women. And especially trans women that do sex work in France. So it was a huge engine of my politicization. And that's how I met Révolution Permanente, was preparing to launch a presidential campaign, a revolutionary campaign with Anas Kazib. It was in the midst of this campaign, and we had profound discussions about reform, revolution, about the role of the working class, which was a very, a revolutionary idea for me because I come from Russia, where today the class struggle is incredibly weak because of the repression, because of also the regression of class consciousness and the heavy legacy of the Soviet Union under Stalinist bureaucracy. So it was a very huge experience for me to discover what class struggle can look like in France, because immediately after I came, there was the Gilets Jaunes movement, which was a massive insurrectionary movement that had even the potential to topple the government. That was my introduction to basically French politics and another way to do politics, which is not institutional, electoral, but that takes place through a mass movement. And next year, after Gilets jaunes, there was the pension strike reform. And that also had a huge impression on me because it showed the power of the organized working class to fight an antisocial reform of Macron's neoliberal government. So when I met RP, it made a lot of sense. The strategy of a revolutionary group that puts in the center the role of a working class that can paralyze the economy, the production, also the transportation system in France, and seeing how that can also be used to fight oppression, to fight racist oppression, to fight gender oppression was a huge political breakthrough for me. Right now, I'm an activist both at Révolution Permanente, but also at the group Bread and Roses, du Pain de Rose. And basically, what we try to do is socialist revolutionary fraction inside the feminist and LGBT movement. And basically, we try to reconstruct the tradition of revolutionary socialist feminism and of the 19th century, of the beginning of the 20th century, of revolutionaries like Rosa Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin, Alexandra Kollontai, that basically merged their socialist politics, but also the way they spoke and considered women's issues and the advancement of the democratic rights of oppressed. That was profoundly articulated with a revolutionary project and with building a revolutionary party to topple capitalism. And so basically that's what we try to recreate, to rebuild in the 20th century against liberal feminism, postmodern feminism, basically all the variants of feminism that basically consider that the feminist and LGBT struggle is separate from the class struggle, from anti-racist struggle, anti-imperialist struggle. We are making huge progress with Dupain de Rose. For example, just last year, we organized the biggest mobilization in the history of this country for trans rights. And I feel like revolutionary activism has been a very powerful tool for me to find a political voice and to find a way to change our reality and also to have a maybe even a chance to change the future of 21st century.
Yeah, I think that's a great overview. And in particular, I love that you mentioned, of course, revolutionary strategy and also mentioning this in the context of fighting oppression and, fighting for, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, using working class methods. And I hope that this is something we'll kind of emphasize throughout this conversation is the importance of these kind of strategic points that you mention and these strategies, these politics and tactics. I think also that would be helpful to kind of set the context of what I'd love to talk about in this conversation in terms of the attacks on LGBTQ people, because on this podcast, on the website, we've talked a lot about the US perspective. So, kind of the obvious is, of course, attacks from people like Donald Trump or even people like
Yeah.
Ron DeSantis in Florida. We've also talked a bit about the Democrats, their attacks, but also kind of their capitulations to the right as well, including, Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom most recently. But a reason I was really excited to talk to you about this is because, as we know, this is an international phenomenon, and actually many of the very sort of reactionary arguments and policies that we hear in the United States are almost identical to what figures in Europe say and propose, like in France. So my first question to you really is, what does this attack on LGBTQ people look like in Europe, and what are some of the parallels that you see with the United States?
We are living through a very important moment. There's a lot of elements of change and new elements coming. And I feel like for a lot of young LGBT, trans, queer people, it's a moment of political revelation of like what the future holds for us. Because I feel like a lot of people in France are obviously shocked by what is happening in the United States about the basically the ban of legal transition, the state basically reversing all the legal transition documents, sending a passport to even like to a famous actress like Hunter Schaffer, saying male in her passport. And I think a lot of people here follow very closely every attack by the Supreme Court, by different states against the LGBT and trans rights in the United States. For example, Roe versus Wade was a huge shock for us here in France. And I think for a lot of people, it showed that, the different feminist LGBT rights that were conquered, like in the last decades, they are not invincible. They can be taken back. You have to fight to protect them. Here, the far right organizes campaigns against abortion. They organize a yearly march against abortion rights that has more and more people, and especially worryingly young people participating. And obviously in France last year we had a first major legislative attack from the far right against the rights of trans minors, with basically the far right wanting to ban the transitions of trans minors and even like punish the doctors, the medical staff that helps them, basically to criminalize health workers that help trans minors. That is obviously not just a French phenomenon. In UK, under a left government, like a supposedly left government under the Labour Party of Keir Starmer, which is obviously a very neoliberal, Zionist, reactionary type of left that wages war against migrants. Under this government, the Supreme Court took a decision to basically say that trans women are not women, that they should be excluded out of single-sex spaces. And, the Starmer government supported it, and basically also they did not revert the decision of a previous conservative government of the Tories to basically severely ban the transitions of minors. So we see that this is happening in France, this is happening in Britain. We see the attacks of Giorgia Meloni in Italy. Obviously, we see the examples happening in the Eastern Europe with basically a war that has been declared to LGBT and trans people by Viktor Orban in Hungary, by Vladimir Putin in Russia. And for a very long time, we had a superficial, artificial opposition between the authoritarian regimes in the Eastern Europe, between the Hungary and Russia, and liberal democracies in France, Italy, United Kingdom. And I think like this opposition is no longer, and we can see that even in the liberal bourgeois democracies, these attacks can happen. They can come not only from the far right, not only from the institutional right, but also from the institutional left, also from the liberals. And so it kind of turns on its head the idea of the lesser evil, because we can see that when the winds turn and when the general trend is to attack and oppress LGBT and trans people, to declare them as scapegoats, I think you say in English. Even the parties and the multinational corporations that proclaim to support LGBT community, they turn their politics completely. And I think like right now, what is happening in Europe is also under the influence of the political comeback by Donald Trump. It's influenced also by Trump making a lot of pressure on multinational corporations to end their diversity and inclusion politics. For example, I think it was very significant when Mark Zuckerberg recorded the video to say that we were entering a new era, the end of protections for LGBT, for Black and Brown and Latino people on Meta, allowing the far-right harassment of the oppressed on social media. And I think in some way, Mark Zuckerberg was right. It is a beginning of a new era because, 10 years ago, Mark Zuckerberg and also like the female CEO of Meta, I keep forgetting her name, but
Sheryl Sandberg.
Sheryl Sandberg, exactly, the one that was, proclaiming the lean-in feminism. That was the symbol of liberal corporate feminism. 10 years later, he's embracing, masculinist, chauvinist politics to cater to far-right, authoritarian Bonapartist president of the United States. That set a trend for the capitalist on an international scale. And I think we are seeing a huge tide reversal in terms of institutional and corporate support for LGBT rights. And that's why I think it's a very, very important moment. And we have to analyze it, we have just to discuss about it, and we have to organize real political discussions with new generations of LGBT activists, but also the older ones, the ones that believed for some years that it was possible to advance the LGBT rights step by step, cosmetic reform by cosmetic reform, and continue in this linear manner in a very incremental reformist approach. And I think the older generations right now, some of them, they realize the dead end that this has been. And the new generations, they understand the critical situations that we are in, but they do not yet have an approach, a strategy to deal with this.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this really interesting thing you just said about this perception that progress for the LGBT community is linear, it's step by step, it's going to continue. Because I think that what makes the moment right now really shocking and jarring, especially for people who did think that everything is just going to get better and better, everything is going to
Yeah,
progress, it's that it really feels like we're moving backwards. Like I personally,
yeah,
for example, I grew up in the 90s and 2000s, and I remember the huge debates around same sex marriage. I remember there were no queer people, no trans people on TV. It was a huge deal when Laverne Cox was on Orange is the New Black on Netflix as a
yeah.
black trans woman.
The
So,
tipping point, yeah,
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And so it felt like, yes, of course, there are limits. I'm not going to sit here and say I think that queer rights were won when we got, same sex marriage or whatever. But it did
yeah.
feel like we were kind of like, quote unquote, like winning. And it felt like we were being accepted more and more and more. And so I think to understand how we've reached this present moment with this really kind of shocking change, as I think a lot of liberals especially would put it, it's helpful also to talk about the context of the last few decades. And so, could you talk a little bit about this context of this gradual acceptance of LGBTQ people? And in particular, I'd love if you could talk a little bit about this idea of progressive neoliberalism.
I mean, if we want to understand what is the current moment, we have to talk about what came before. We have to go back to the origins of the LGBT movement, also of the feminist movement on the international level. The LGBT movement, the feminist movement in the 60s, in the 70s, was a whole another thing but what we have today, because there was an element of radical groups participating. The LGBT movement started with revolts against police violence. And after that, we had, groups emerging in the LGBT movement that had a much more legalist, reformist, incremental approach of trying to plead the authorities to take legislative action in favor of LGBT groups, basically acting as a lobby group among the lobby groups, but for the interests of the LGBT community, the members of the community that had the most access to power, that were more well educated, that were belonging to a higher social class. Basically, they became representatives of the community to try to plead with business owners, with the members of the government, to go take places in the institutions and try to basically change the system from the inside and gain gradual acceptance, integration, and also visibility. Like I think like the decades that we're talking about, like of gradual acceptance, it was like the idea, the illusion that if we were patient, if we would explain, if we would become more visible, if we would be in shows, if we would be on Orange is the New Black, on Netflix shows, on Amazon shows, things would gradually change and people would accept. And, like I think about the moment the series, like a TV show Transparent came out, that was produced by Amazon, and the showrunner of this show received an Emmy, and they came to the stage and they basically thanked Jeff Bezos for offering an incredible visibility opportunity for the trans community and of upholding trans voices. And that was like I think like 10 years ago. And you can see like how the tides, have turned 10 years later. And I think like those moments of like basically I think liberal LGBT innocence and like optimism about the future. I think the term that Nancy Fraser uses of progressive neoliberalism is very apt and efficient, because it describes like a very particular period of time that, where liberals were proclaiming the end of history, the final triumph of capitalism and liberalism, the fall of Soviet Union, capitalism as the only possible perspective with no alternative. And that basically combined, yeah, obviously like neoliberal economics, austerity, antisocial attacks, the politics that favor the rich, that basically favor the banks, the corporations, but at the same time catering to some minority interests and offering some democratic rights to women, to LGBT people, and basically integrating them in the state, at least some of the sectors, the most well-off sectors, and basically offering them a chance to some of those sectors to even elevate them socially and become part of even of a ruling class, like with some LGBT people ascending to become also like business owners, etc., etc. And I think like it was a huge trap that LGBT people walked in, because it also generated a reaction. And we can see that this utopia of progressive neoliberalism has started to shatter at the time that Trump has won in 2016. And what came to confront the progressive neoliberalism is reactionary populism that was basically contesting, the terrible prices of living, the inflations, never-ending wars, and basically saying that it was like with the fault and the solution was, trans people coming and using women bathrooms, that the scapegoat was immigrants, Muslims, but also LGBT people, and basically showing that LGBT and feminist communities and rights are basically intertwined with power, that showed some tolerance and acceptance for them. And basically our community has politically our political community has walked into a trap of becoming co-opted by the state, and then it allowed the reaction, the right, to direct the popular anger, frustration against our community, because they represent us as being privileged by the state. That's what Milei does in Argentina. That was what Bolsonaro was doing in Brazil. That's what the French far right is doing as well. Right now, we're having the beginning of the end of this moment, and I think like the return of the Trump to the White House in 2025 basically consolidates this dynamic. And I think like it's not the end just yet, but it's the beginning of the end. So it's a very like transitory period. Like you have some sectors of bourgeoisie and corporations still catering to the LGBT community and trying to play like woke corporate politics. And you have some others that basically understood the shift of the tides and start to censor LGBT topics, do not market anymore on the Pride Month, and basically also like the governments that yesterday were saying that they support our rights, basically reversing course. So I think it shows also like for me like the urgency and the need for revolutionary and anti-capitalist LGBT politics, because I think that would be the way also to show that we are not complicit of antisocial attacks. We're not complicit of neoliberalism and neoliberalism economic order. We are against it and we fight it. And our interests are one of the same as working class. And today, I think the far right is playing this division game very well. And they succeed in some places to fabricate a strong polarization and opposition against LGBT and trans people, and also against feminists. And we have to try to break this division tactic. And I think it's obvious how the far right is using it. Like if you study the polemics and scandals on wokeism on American campus, it's identical to what the far right is saying on the French campus. It's they have the same method they are deploying on international level, and I think the antidote for that is LGBT class politics, it's LGBT revolutionary politics, trying to build actively a political alliance with the working class. And I think that will break through the division and create something very powerful that will succeed to overcome the division tactics of the far right.
That's so interesting to hear you say that. For example, the anti-woke discourse and things like that is also present in France and in French universities, because I think that we
Yeah.
here in the United States, we feel like it's like a very kind of American phenomenon because of how long this has been going on among American politicians, among Republicans in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely started in the United States, but the right and the far right around the world is inspired by the methods of the American far right. So we have exactly the same discourse about the public education being too woke, about teachers talking about things they shouldn't in the classroom, about LGBT topics, about Palestine, basically about anti-racism. And I know that's also like what the Republican governors and the vice president JD Vance, they do a lot of noise about. So it's very similar tactics, and when I see that, you see how artificial it is, and you see how conscious the far right is of those division tactics. So we have to be very conscious as well on what is our response and how do we overcome it. And I think for me, the divide that neoliberal progressivism, or like progressive neoliberalism, has created between the LGBT community and the working class is like LGBT community, like a special interest group that is favored by the advances of the democratic rights, just as the whole of the working class is disfavored by the antisocial attacks. We have to overcome the legacy of this divide. We have to show that, by the way, most members of the LGBT community are working class. They do jobs to survive, and some of them can't even get a job because they are discriminated on the basis of that they are queer, gay, lesbian, trans. And so in some parts of the world, it's the most precarious members of the working class. So I think we should also have a discussion about the fact that, LGBT community is not a homogeneous group. It's also divided by class. It has also inside it, members of the bourgeoisie, members of the petite bourgeoisie, members of the working class, and they have different class interests. And that also explains how you can have so many LGBT political groups with completely diametrally opposed politics. You can have capitalist liberal groups, you can have Zionist groups, you can have anti-imperialist revolutionary groups, and we should have an honest discussion about it. And I think like in feminism and LGBT fights today, we should have a lot of debate about the direction that our activism has been going in the last years and decades, and how we should change it. Because I think like the things that we have been doing have not necessarily worked all the time, because we are now in an extremely critical situation on an international level. The tactics and the strategy of incremental reform has spectacularly failed. And right now, I think we should really think about the fact that there's a global, like a worldwide war being waged against LGBT people. And I think like we should think about also global international solutions to fight it. I'm probably like one of the people that's like in the French left that takes very seriously what is happening trans people in the United States. For me, this is a model for the future of all of the far rights on an international level. And also, I come from a country, Russia, where in the span of 5-10 years, the government has banned all LGBT and trans rights. And right now, you have people in jail. They are political prisoners for the sole fact that they are LGBT. You have people that had to leave the country to flee persecution by the state. And that is, for me, the future of decadent capitalism and failing liberal democracies unless we organize mass movements and class struggle to fight it. We should be very conscious of the fact that, for me, like the far right, their end objective, uh, uh, beyond the polemics and beyond the scandals and beyond the media noise that they do, their end project for LGBT and trans people is basically push them outside of society. And I think we should be very lucid about where it can be headed. Like right now, the U.S. administration is sending people to Salvador concentration camps, detaining them without release date, and using Guantanamo Bay to detain immigrants. That's how brutal the far right can be, and that's what their methods are. So I think we have an extremely powerful enemy that I take extremely seriously, and I think we should, like, the questions of strategy to fight this enemy is crucial. Like it should be the opening subject of every conversation we are having
Totally.
in the LGBT community.
Let's talk a little bit about strategy, and I think it can also be kind of informative to talk about the failed strategies that you've kind of alluded to or touched on already. Because here in the United States, for example, a lot of leftists, a lot of LGBTQ people are still working with the Democrats, and they have this idea that, kind of like you were saying, you can work from within capitalism, you can work from within corporations, and
Yeah.
you can basically like push these people, these capitalist politicians, left on trans issues. Or actually, I mean, in some cases, I feel like people on the left here aren't even really trying to push politicians left, because there was this thing that happened toward the end of Kamala Harris's campaign where she was asked, what would you do about trans healthcare for minors or something like that? And her response was just, I would follow the law. And a lot of people were just like, oh, well, Kamala Harris is being strategic. And, if we as queer people, or especially as trans people, if we're just quiet enough, if we don't make too much movement or sound, we'll get rights, basically. And, we have to focus instead on economic issues and things like that, and not focus
Yeah.
on queer issues. So, my question to you is, do you see similar strategic errors in Europe? And why is this a bad strategy? Like, I'm kind of creating a leading question here, but why can't we win queer liberation through, for example, the Democrats in the US, but also, the UK Labour Party, or for example, by, being nice enough to Emmanuel Macron in France?
I mean, what you are talking about, and I think it's an international strategy, unfortunately, of a lot of activists for the rights of the oppressed. What you're talking about is the lesser evil strategy. It exists in every country. Like in every country where you have a far right, people try to find an alternative in the institutional politics landscape, and they try to support it, even though it can be reactionary, neoliberal, extremely problematic on every front. And sometimes it can lead people to rehabilitate even the real enemies of the LGBT community, of the immigrant community, also of the working class. And I think, like in the United States, the support for the Democratic Party as a strategy for election campaign after election campaign, and every time everyone is saying this is the most important election of our lifetime. If you do not vote for Joe Biden or for Kamala Harris, basically you support fascism. And I think we can see the end results of that. Like when you say that Democrats are the lesser evil in the face of the Republicans, I don't even understand how you can say that after the term of Joe Biden, that basically showed him supporting one of the worst crimes of the 21st century, which is the genocide in Palestine. What kind of lesser evil logic can tolerate the
Totally.
mass murder in the Gaza Strip by Israel with military, political, economical help from the United States and from the Democrats? And that's just one of the many crimes that this administration has committed. They deported immigrants also on a mass scale. They detained children in detainment camps. There were several LGBT and trans immigrants that were dead in the ICE detainment facilities during the Biden term. And when people speak about the lesser evil, that's the only things I can think about. When they say lesser evil, I think about Kamala Harris going to South America and saying to the immigrants that are fleeing war, hunger, the economic disaster that was foisted upon them by the US imperialist intervention in Latin America. And she said, do not come to the millions of immigrants that are basically fleeing countries destroyed by the United States. So for me, honestly, I do not understand the political compromise that people do when they support the Democrats in the United States, when they support Die Linke, that also has pro-Israel politics, that also did apology basically of a genocide in Palestine, that support the Labour Party in the UK, that showed after they got elected that they are not the lesser evil. They wage war on immigrants as well. They support, transphobic decisions of the Supreme Court. They just try to close down Palestine Action, which is a pro-Palestine group. They imprisoned several of its activists. That's the content of the lesser evil. In France, the lesser evil strategy was completely disastrous last year. We had legislative elections, and basically all of the feminist and LGBT groups in France supported the lesser evil option of the left coalition, going from the ex-Trotskyist but far left group NPA, going from NPA to Parti Socialiste, also of course with La France Insoumise, the Green Party in France, the Communist Party, but going through all those parties to Parti Socialiste, which has been one of the main parties of the regime for the last decades. And basically, this support of supposed lesser evil of Nouveau Front Populaire, this coalition, it allowed to give an incredible weight in the parliament to the Parti Socialiste. And now, what are they doing with this new weight given to them by the lesser evil logic? They saved Macron's government. What are they doing with this newfound weight? They are attacking Palestine movement. I think the lesser evil tactic is a very dangerous one because it's very short-sighted. It does not see that, by supporting the institutional left, the capitalist parties, the imperialist parties, in the face of a bigger danger, which is the far right, basically you do not calculate all the consequences, because if the institutional left comes to power through this lesser evil defensive movement through elections, when they come to power and when they disappoint and when they betray, and they will disappoint and they will betray, the power of the reaction and the power of the far right is going to be even stronger 4 years later. And I think the comeback of Trump to power in 2025 is the proof of that. The Democrats have had disastrous 4 years. They spent a lot of time and effort in the Ukraine war, consolidating NATO. They continued imperialist intervention in the Middle East. They supported the genocide in Palestine. And the only thing they had to offer in the national politics is basically building some bridges and, driving the egg prices and the gas prices so high that people were, had a cost of living crisis, and every economic metric, homelessness, everything went up under Biden. And it's just natural that some sectors that supported this administration several years ago did not come out to vote for 4 years later, or switched to Trump. It's not an accident. It's direct consequences of this lesser evil compromise. And I think it's incredibly problematic that we suffer a lot of pressure as revolutionary leftists to basically abandon our politics and to basically capitulate to these parties, to the Democratic Party, to Nouveau Front Populaire in France, to Labour Party, because every time they tell us this is not the moment. This is the most important election of our lifetime. It's time to put our disagreements aside, you have to support the party that has the most chance to win, and that is the only way. And that means that there's never going to be a good time for revolutionary class independent politics. And I think right now it's the time in the United States, in Argentina, in Brazil, in France, in Italy, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, to build an alternative to these capitalist parties, to these institutional left parties that have failed, and failed again and again and again. I think we should look in a very sober manner on the end results of 10 years of institutional left, of Sanders movement in the United States, of Syriza in Greece, of Jeremy Corbyn, a wing of the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, on Peronism, on also on PSOL and Lula in Brazil. We should, really study what has happened in the last 2 decades and look at the state of the world. I think the state of the world has never been more dire. We are heading towards global climate catastrophe. We are living right now through several wars. We have potentially a regional and even a war on even a bigger scale in the Middle East. The time has never been more urgent to start building independent and revolutionary politics. That's why I think every social movement has to radically change course. And even like when I think about the United States, I think about the power of Black Lives Matter movement that you had just several years ago. From France, it looked for us as almost like a potential, revolutionary moment in the United States. You had like police stations burning and mass movement with a lot of anger, going through the whole of the United States, and it launched even mass anti-racist demonstrations in the United Kingdom, but also in France. We had one of the biggest demonstrations on anti-racist topics of all time during the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it had an incredible potential, but it was then co-opted by the Democratic Party, and it became a movement canalized to re-elect Joe Biden against Donald Trump. And I think when you see at the end result of it, Trump was able to come back just 4 years later. Electing a lesser evil is just hiding the problem. It's not, beating really the far right, assuring that they can never come back. And contrary to the liberals, I do not like to lose, and I do not like to whimper in the face of my enemies. I would like to win, and I would like, to have the possibility to obtain a definitive victory against our political enemies. So I think we should push aside the loser strategies that do not work and try something else.
Concretely, also, a lot of these rollbacks that we've seen in terms of social movements, in terms of women's rights, in terms of LGBTQ rights, a lot of these things have precisely happened under these so-called lesser evil
Yeah,
regimes, or lesser evil
exactly.
governments, I should say.
Roe versus Wade, for example. Yeah.
Exactly, Roe versus Wade, and a lot of this anti-trans healthcare rollbacks in the United States. So I think that that's really true. And so, we've talked about now how these are failing strategies, and I think you've articulated very well the problems with lesser evilism. But I think sometimes people can feel like this discussion of revolutionary strategy, of socialist strategy, of centering the working class can feel maybe a little bit abstract. And
Yeah.
so I wanted to ask, what strategy should the left use instead of this lesser evil strategy? What tactics should we put forward to, of course, finally beat back the far right, but also concretely in terms of Pride Month, to finally win LGBTQ rights, queer liberation, without just going back to this failed step by step liberal strategy?
I feel like we should start by the fact that we will not win trans liberation and LGBT liberation and feminist liberation under the current system, and that we should aim for a resolute fight against the system in its entirety, against the capitalist system. That said, obviously, we have also a lot of immediate struggles, and we should fight for the defense of democratic rights. We should fight to obtain the new democratic rights. And those struggles are also a learning ground for the bigger struggle that is going to come in a revolutionary situation that can open up in this period of a profound crisis of the capitalist system. I think we can see that on the international level we have many and many examples in the last years of mass movement, of significant strike movements, like even like in France in 2019 and in 2023. So we can see that the crisis of capitalism is generating a lot of class struggle, but we should also think about that the thing that is lacking in all of this class struggle mayhem and chaos that shakes the capitalist system is also the revolutionary organizations that can intervene with a specific program, with a specific strategy that they can offer to the mass movement as an efficient way to go as far as possible in the struggle against the power, the government, and the system that basically gives all the political power to the capitalists. And I think, like, for me, what was a very, I would say, revolutionary realization is understanding the role of a revolutionary party and also its potential to change reality and to have an impact on the course of the class struggle. And I feel like it's something that I was able to understand not through books and not through reading Lenin and Marx, even though it helped as well, reading Trotsky as well, but through very empiric experience of intervening with comrades from Revolution Permanente in the mass strike movement of 2023, and seeing how we try to organize links and coordination between different sectors that were striking and that were participating in the movement, and trying to build something more solid, radical, and imaginative and determined than the strategy that was proposed by the direction, basically by the union bureaucracy in France. For example, we were organizing at the time a network of workers that were pushing for a strike, a limitless strike, with several consecutive days of strike, and not just the strategy of having a strike one day a week, which is a very weak and inefficient strategy that was pushed by the union bureaucracy. And basically, we were agitating this limitless strike approach throughout the whole pension reform movement, and we touched thousands and thousands of workers through our social media agitation, through the rallies that we organized, through the political meetings we organized, through also like we were canvassing the country. And that idea and this perspective took some influence and some place in the movement. And that was us intervening in the mass movement of millions of people as a small group of several hundred activists. And that moment struck my political imagination, because I was saying to myself, if we can do this now and touch thousands and thousands of workers, what we will be able to do tomorrow when we are an organization that counts 1,000 and 1,500 activists that are experienced, that are well trained politically. And that showed me the impact that we can have on politics on a national scale. And I think everything that we have done since has been the proof of that as well. And for me, for example, I was very also impressed by the fact that with Dupin de Rose, when in France we had the anti-trans attacks last year by the right and the far right, basically everything that I've learned about intervening in the mass movement in 2023 in the pension reform struggle, I tried to apply it to this new situation of anti-trans attacks. And we decided to launch a nationwide initiative that was inviting worker unions, political parties to basically create a front, like a united front, to fight these legislative attacks. And we wrote a text to call for mobilization. We tried to convene meetings, we tried to convene assemblies in which hundreds of people participated. And we basically also proposed to groups all around the country and even like in the neighbor country, Belgium, to organize demonstrations, marches, rallies. And last year, on the 5th of May, in 2 weeks of intense activism, we succeeded to put 25,000 people in the streets in 50 cities around France and also in Belgium. And that showed that the LGBT community is not powerless in the face of the attacks, and especially that it does not need to fight alone, and that can also mobilize the worker unions. It can also mobilize student organizations. We had anti-racist activists speaking on our rallies. We had even striking workers coming to the rallies. And for us, it was a lesson that, for example, there's an idea that takes hold in several countries of like separatist feminism, like a feminism that's opposed to men, or like also like in LGBT community, there's also an idea that members of unions and the members of political parties, they should just come and help us to organize the marches and the rallies. But they shouldn't speak politically. They shouldn't come with their flags. They should just be behind us and sort of help us logistically, but they shouldn't be part of the movement. And I think we proved that it's possible to have an approach that is completely opposed to this logic and that tries to mobilize not only members of LGBT communities, but sectors that are much larger than that. And for us, our goal is that the struggle for the trans rights and the struggle for LGBT and feminist rights, that it's not just carried by women and LGBT people, even though we have to be at the forefront of this fight, that's obvious, but it should be carried by millions and millions of people. My dream is that we have a fight against the regime that expresses all those issues, that expresses the fight against the pension reform, against the antisocial attacks of Macron's government, but also carries the fight against the genocide in Palestine and the complicity of the French government in that, but also carries the fight for LGBT and trans rights, and refuses the division that the right is trying to impose. And I think that way we can do something that's much more powerful than the 1% of society that constitutes the trans community. We are an infinitely small minority in the society, and I think we should think strategically what would be the most powerful way to create a force that is capable to win rights, to put the government and the power in the defensive position and have to make concessions. And even we should aim higher. We should aim for the overthrow of capitalist society and the political and economic system. And for me, that is the only way that we can overcome transphobia and gender oppression. That's the way that you transform consciousness of millions and tens of millions of people, and that you show them in the process of a revolutionary struggle that their enemy is not the immigrant, is not the Muslim, is not the Jew, is not a trans person, but the people that detain all the political and economic power in the society. And so for me, often I think like the discussion about transphobia and sexism and racism can be formulated in a very moral sense, like there are good people that are progressive and there are bad people that are reactionary. But I think we live in a very reactionary and oppressive society. Nobody can escape that. For me, I had a very oppressive education and upbringing. And basically, for example, I always say that I was raised in the culture of Russian chauvinism. My society formed me, and I think like there's tens of millions and billions of people that are living through the same under capitalism. And so for me, no wonder millions and millions of people can be under the influence of reactionary ideas, and we should think as parts of the press community of how we can transform this consciousness and try to erase years and years of ideological formation that was built up by the school, the media, the state propaganda. And for me, that will come through the process of mass fight and mass mobilization, mass class struggle. Like also the recent example of mobilization in Argentina, where in the face of rhetorical attacks of Milei at the Davos Economic Forum, where he treated LGBT people, he insulted them by comparing them to pedophiles and sex abusers. There was mass mobilization with, I think, several 100,000 people in every major town in Argentina. And, they used the same method that we used with our mobilization for trans rights. They invited unions, they invited student organizations, and it was much stronger than if it was just the LGBT community. And I think for me, like the examples in the United States are very inspiring. You have Starbucks workers that are members of the LGBT community that organize strikes to fight for their rights as strongest workers, as LGBT workers. I think there was even a strike when Starbucks decided to hide their Pride Month symbols, because like this is part of the trend that we were discussing of the end of progressive neoliberalism. And I think like when we succeed to have jobs in the service sector, in the healthcare sector, in the education sectors, we should also leverage our power as workers. We should convince our colleagues, and we should organize as well as workers. And that for me is also a very powerful answer. And there are several examples of factory workers and other sectors workers striking sometimes to defend their trans colleagues. There are examples like this in the United States, in Argentina, in France as well. And I think this moment of class solidarity, but also like using your position as part of the working class to counter oppression is something that is always very powerful and that succeeds to overcome and eliminate prejudice. I would just really like to finish on the idea that we are facing a level of unprecedented oppression. Like again, I think like there's a global worldwide war waged against the trans community, and we should take that extremely seriously. Like I think in the 21st century, we will see huge crimes committed against the trans and LGBT community on levels that we do not yet capable of imagining. That means that the stakes are literally life or death. To face that, you cannot use the lesser evil strategy and just short-term political vision. You should think about what it will happen 5-10 years from now and how you will be able to confront the dire and extremely difficult conditions that will come later down the road with unprecedented far-right offensives. And I think like building revolutionary parties not just on a national scale but on an international scale, and being able to fight for far right like we are doing in France, in Argentina, in the United States with our international Trotskyist fraction of the Fourth International. Rebuilding Trotskyist revolutionary left on an international level is an incredible political investment in the future, because if we really want to be able to fight capitalist on a global scale, if we want to fight the reaction, if we want to fight anti-immigrant, anti-trans attacks, that is the best weapon and the best tool that we can have. Liberals and reformists, they never organize on an international level. Revolutionaries do, because we understand that capitalism is a global system, that its systems of oppression also operate on a global scale. And so what we're doing today is extremely, extremely important. And the fact that revolution was possible and was accomplished even in a country as backward and difficult as Russia 100 years ago. Not even one revolution. There was 3 revolutions in 1905, 2 revolutions in 1917. I think that is an example that should be a guiding point for us as revolutionaries in the 21st centuries, and we should take a lot of lessons from this period of time, from what was the strategy of the Bolshevik Party, of Lenin, of Trotsky, of all those revolutionaries that gave their lives to fulfill a revolutionary project in Russia, in Germany, around the world. And that is our task in the 21st century. And I think like what Rosa Luxemburg was saying in her famous quote, the choices between barbarism or socialism is still very true today. It's going to be us or it's going to be them. The victory of a revolutionary project or it's going to be a total reaction. That is the way I understand our political and historical responsibility. And that is the way I hope many, many LGBT comrades will, come to this realization as well and become revolutionary activists. And really, there's a lot of people that are pessimistic and that feel like there's no change possible. And I feel like it's the opposite of linear optimism that we had before. People were saying, our rights will advance no matter what. And then they were shocked by Roe versus Wade and the reversal of several other democratic rights. I feel like right now, pessimism and fatalism is the reverse side of that. You can just see, people like things progressing towards more authoritarianism and oppression, etc. And you cannot see that us fighting and us organizing a consequential, strong fight against it can also change the course of the future. And I'm a big believer in the possibility of changing history. And that's what we want to do with Révolution Permanente and Dupont de Rose in France, but also with FT, the Trotskyist fraction, on an international global scale.
I think that's a really powerful place to end this conversation, and also a very hopeful and inspiring place to end the conversation. So with that, I want to say thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.